Soul Fracturing and the Creation of Altars, the Inner Architecture of Ritual Control. Welcome back. I'm Adeline Atlas, 11 times published author, and this is the Occult Families How to Spot Them series. Trigger warning. This video series covers disturbing and very serious topics. Full legal disclaimer in the video description below. Before we explore the dual identities ritual families wear in public and private, we must understand what happens internally. What happens to the soul of the child born into the system? This video reveals one of the most critical control mechanisms used by occult families, soul fracturing. That is, the intentional breaking of your internal self through trauma, not just as collateral damage, but as design. Ritual abuse is not simply about control, it is about division, and that division begins with your own consciousness. In occult families, trauma is not random or chaotic. It is a calculated tool used to split the psyche, fragment the soul, and create internal compartments that serve the system. These fragments, sometimes called altars, are not always as dramatic as what is depicted in media portrayals of dissociative identity disorder, but they are very real. They are the internal containers where pain, roles, and spiritual contracts are stored. Each fracture is a chamber, and within each chamber lives a version of you that was created not by nature, but by force. The process begins early. Many survivors report trauma starting in infancy or even in utero. The first 7 years of life are the most spiritually plastic. During this time, repeated abuse, especially paired with confusion, betrayal, and spiritual violation, can fracture the soul in a way that leaves permanent energetic divides. These divides are not just psychological, they are metaphysical. The soul, in its natural form, is whole. But when subjected to extreme, repeated trauma, particularly the kind that includes sexual violation, spiritual inversion, and betrayal by caregivers, the soul cannot stay fully intact. To survive, it fragments. Why do they want you fragmented? Because wholeness is dangerous to their system. A whole person is sovereign. A whole person is unpredictable. A whole person remembers. But a fragmented person? A fragmented person can be programmed. They can be controlled, compartmentalized, and turned against themselves. That is the root of soul fracturing in ritual systems, not just to weaken you, but to use you. This is where we begin to touch on the dark intersection between occult families and MK Ultra style programming. While that's a deeper subject covered in our SOS2 MK Ultra series, it's important to briefly name here that the techniques used by ritual families closely mirror those used in government black programs. Trauma-induced dissociation, identity compartmentalization, and installation of behavioral scripts triggered by code words, symbols, or rituals. The goal is the same, to create internal divisions that can be activated at will and erased when no longer needed. In families of ritual power, this programming is often layered with spiritual contracts. For example, during a ritual event, which could be disguised as a family gathering, holiday, or religious ceremony, the child may be subjected to an experience so overwhelming that the psyche ejects part of itself just to survive. That part, the fragment, becomes its own unit. It may hold the pain, the memory, or even the abilities that the system wants to harness later. Some fragments become workers, versions of the child that know how to perform in ritual space. Others are trained to be sexual, silent, obedient, or even violent. This is not accidental. It is structured fragmentation, the spiritual equivalent of building a control panel inside the person. Over time, this fragmentation becomes invisible, even to the person carrying it. Because the fragments are compartmentalized, they often don't communicate with each other. This can result in memory gaps, time loss, or behaviors that seem uncharacteristic. You may find yourself acting in ways that don't match your core self. You may have flashbacks, phobias, or attractions that seem inexplicable. This is not random chaos. It is the residue of a fractured architecture that was never yours, but is still running inside you. One of the clearest signs of internal fragmentation is the experience of duality within. You may feel like two people, one who smiles, functions, and plays the part, and another who is angry, grieving, or terrified. You may feel like a confident adult in some spaces, and like a small child in others. You may have a part that believes the abuse happened, and another part that insists you made it up. This is the result of soul splits, designed to keep truth away from the surface. And here's the critical part. These splits aren't just energetic. They are used ritually. Many ritual families install altars for specific purposes. For instance, a public altar, the one who shows up at school, excels in performance, and maintains appearances. A loyalty altar, who will defend the family no matter what. A sexual altar, conditioned to respond to abuse with compliance or even perceived pleasure. These aren't characters you consciously choose. They are built through trauma, then reinforced through ritual, symbolism, and familial programming. Soul fracturing also makes spiritual interference easier. Once the soul is divided, it becomes possible for entities to attach to specific fragments. One part of you may be inhabited by a presence that does not belong to you, an ancestral spirit, a ritual entity, or a thought form designed to reinforce obedience. In extreme cases, entire fragments may be leased to the family or its allies, used during rituals. invoked for energetic work, or stored away to be triggered later. This is not metaphor, it is spiritual trafficking. The question then becomes, how do you begin to repair what was broken? First, you stop believing that these parts of you are evidence of damage. They are evidence of survival. Each part was created to carry something you couldn't carry alone. They are not your shame, they are your strength, disguised. Second, you begin the process of reintegration. That means creating internal safety for the parts that were split off. It means meeting your fragments, not with fear, but with compassion. Asking, what were you made to carry? What lie were you taught to protect? What gift were you forced to bury? You may not get answers immediately, but the act of asking begins the repair. Soul retrieval is the spiritual process of recovering these lost parts. It can be done through dream work, journaling, somatic practices, and sometimes shamanic or ceremonial assistance. But the key is intention. You must become the parent, the protector, and the priest for the parts of you that were fractured. No ritual can heal what you still deny, but the moment you acknowledge the fragmentation, not as weakness, but as programming, you begin to unwind the system. This matters deeply as we prepare to discuss dual identity syndrome in the next video. Because the external split, the public versus private persona, is simply the outer mirror of the inner fracture. You cannot understand how these families maintain the illusion of perfection unless you first understand how they create division within. The dual identity they perform on the outside only works because it is mirrored inside the child. That child becomes two people, the one who serves the mask and the one who carries the truth. So before we address the public performance of sainthood, we must address the internal theft of wholeness. Let's summarize what we've uncovered. Ritual families use trauma to intentionally fracture the soul and create compartmentalized altars. These soul splits are used for behavioral control, ritual access, and spiritual interference. Altars are often constructed for specific roles: performance, loyalty, obedience, sexual access. Fractured parts can be targeted by entities, embedded with contracts, or used in ritual without your consent. Fragmentation is not just a byproduct of trauma. It is a method of occult control. Healing requires conscious soul retrieval, integration, and dismantling of the internal architecture. Wholeness is your greatest threat to the system, because a whole person cannot be programmed. If you've ever felt like parts of you don't fit together, like you're living as more than one person, that's not a flaw. That's a scar from a system designed to divide you. But division is not your fate, integration is. And the moment you begin to call all your parts home, the spell starts to break. Now that we've exposed how the internal fractures are created, we're ready to examine how they become performance. How fractured family members wear public masks, enforce private rituals, and maintain the illusion of purity while trafficking in spiritual corruption. That's the system's next layer. That's dual identity syndrome. Let's go there now. Hi, I'm Adeline Atlas, 11 times published author, and what you just watched is part of my signature program, the Chosen One series inside School of Soul. This series is not just a course, it's a blueprint for those who know they were different from the start. The black sheep, the scapegoat, the truth teller, the cycle breaker. Inside, you'll discover the family roles playbook, the golden child, the scapegoat, the enabler, the lost child, and how to finally step out of the part you were cast in without consent. How the black sheep becomes the goat, turning rejection into radical transformation and leadership. How to break generational curses and rewrite ancestral contracts so the pain stops with you. And how to recognize and escape modern forms of spiritual and technological targeting, from gang stalking to synthetic synchronicity. This isn't just about survival. It's about awakening, about reclaiming your voice, your lineage, and your destiny as one of the chosen ones. Click the link below to access the full series now, because the role ends the moment you decide it does, and the real script begins with you.